She had the kind of smile that made America fall in love. The girl next door, the cheerleader, the one every young boy wanted to dance with under prom lights. Elisabeth Shue was the '80s, a dream sculpted by studios, embraced by the masses. But behind the sparkle of Back to the Future and the sweetness of the Karate Kid, there was a silence, a void, a loss that no red carpet could cover. Her heart never left the day she lost her little brother. It shattered, quietly, off camera. This is the untold story of Elisabeth Shue. Her name alone summoned a decade. Elisabeth Shue, blonde, poised, radiating innocence, wasn't just another actress in the '80s. She was the girl every script wanted. She didn't dominate with flamboyance. Instead, she slipped into the audience's heart with subtle charm, soft vulnerability, and a disarming warmth that felt real in a world of Hollywood illusion. Born on October 6, 1963 in Wilmington, Delaware, Elisabeth Judson Shue carried more than just beauty into the spotlight. She brought a calm intelligence to every frame, a grounded presence that made her different from the usual starlets of her time. When The Karate Kid premiered in 1984, Elisabeth wasn't just playing Ali Mills, the pretty blonde who catches Daniel LaRusso's eye. She was defining a role that would become iconic in American pop culture. Ali wasn't helpless. She wasn't just arm candy. She had her own voice, her own spark, and Shue's portrayal made her unforgettable. But she didn't stop there. In Adventures in Babysitting, 1987, Shue took the lead, proving she could carry a film entirely on her shoulders. With rolled-up sleeves, comedic timing, and raw determination, she played Chris Parker, a teenage babysitter thrown into a chaotic night through Chicago, and America followed her every step. Then came the leap through time. Back to the Future Part 2 and Part 3, 1989-1990. Taking over the role of Jennifer Parker, Shue seamlessly stepped into an already beloved franchise, holding her own next to Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd. She was never just a pretty face in these films. She anchored them with emotion, grounding the sci-fi fantasy in something deeply human. She didn't scream for attention. She earned it quietly. Hollywood tabloids at the time loved to call her the all-American sweetheart. Magazines dubbed her the thinking man's crush. She was a different kind of beautiful, less glossy, more authentic. Her voice, soft but articulate. Her eyes, always searching, and the industry noticed. Nominations began to circle. Critics praised her naturalism, calling her one of the few actresses of her era who doesn't need a monologue to break your heart. She wasn't chasing fame. Fame, somehow, chased her. And yet, beneath the camera lights and velvet gowns, something was always held back. She smiled for the press, walked the carpets, nodded through interviews. But those who knew her well, co-stars, friends, even directors, sensed there was more behind those eyes, a hesitation, a sadness not yet spoken. Elisabeth Shue may have belonged to the screen, but parts of her had already begun to drift into silence. Before the red carpets, before the cameras, before Hollywood ever knew her name, there was a house in South Orange, New Jersey. It was filled with music, laughter, and chaos, a warm suburban childhood in the 1970s, where Elisabeth Shue was just one of 4 siblings. Among them, William Shue, Bill as everyone called him, stood out. Tall, athletic, kind. Her younger brother, her closest friend, they were inseparable. While Elisabeth leaned toward acting, Bill pursued sports, eventually becoming a promising athlete at Rutgers University. But more than that, he was her compass, her anchor. the one who reminded her of who she was, away from the makeup chairs and movie trailers. As Elisabeth's career began to take flight in the mid-'80s, she remained grounded by her relationship with her family, especially Bill. He was the one who would fly out to see her on set, the one who called after every premiere, the one who knew the real Elisabeth, not the one airbrushed in magazines. Then came 1988. It was supposed to be an ordinary weekend. Bill was competing in a triathlon in New York, fit, determined, focused as ever. Elisabeth was shooting, unable to be there, trusting he would be fine, like always. But life doesn't wait for permission. During the cycling leg of the race, Bill was struck by a vehicle. The accident was violent, sudden, irreversible. He was just 26 years old. The news didn't arrive softly. It landed like a scream through the walls of Elisabeth's world. She had faced rejection before, bad roles, harsh critics, tough producers, but nothing prepared her for this. This wasn't a career stumble. This was loss, not a metaphor, not a subplot. It was real and merciless. She withdrew, not publicly, not dramatically, but something inside her cracked and never quite healed. Friends noticed a change, a stillness, a weight behind her usual grace. She continued working, but each performance felt more solitary, more introspective. In interviews, she rarely brought it up. Hollywood didn't ask, and she didn't offer. It was too sacred, too sharp. But the grief found its way into her art. In 1995's Leaving Las Vegas, Shue played Sarah, a sex worker navigating emotional wreckage alongside a dying man. It was a performance drenched in sorrow, fragility, and resilience, and it earned her an Oscar nomination. What audiences saw as artistry was, in many ways, a channeling of pain, a quiet scream folded into each glance, each line. Only years later did she begin to speak softly about what happened. She would mention Bill in passing, say his name with reverence, acknowledge how he shaped her and how losing him nearly ended her path in the industry altogether. "I didn't think I could go on," she once admitted. "He was the one who reminded me what really mattered. Without him, everything else felt artificial for a long time." But she didn't retreat forever. Instead, Elisabeth Shue began to carry his memory with her, not as a wound, but as a weight she chose to hold, quietly, strongly. While Hollywood moved on to new starlets and flashier headlines, she rebuilt herself, not for the cameras, but for the people who still mattered in her life, her family, her future children, the parts of herself that Bill had once loved most. She never used his death as a platform, never turned it into a cause. There was no campaign, no foundation, only a whispered presence in her performances, a shade of mourning in every character's smile, a shadow she no longer ran from. The world knew Elisabeth Shue as radiant, composed, untouchable, but her truest form lived in the silence after loss. Hollywood doesn't wait for mourning. It keeps spinning, casting, recasting, applauding new faces as old ones fade quietly out of frame. In the years following her brother's death, Elisabeth Shue faced a choice that few could see, but one that she felt with every fiber of her being. She could disappear. She could leave the industry that suddenly felt so hollow, so detached from real emotion. Let the spotlight dim. Let the memory of Bill remain untainted by the glare of movie sets. But she didn't. She stayed, not out of vanity, not out of ambition, but as an act of resilience, a silent rebellion against being defined by grief. Yet the Elisabeth Shue who returned to Hollywood in the early 1990s was not the same ingenue who had charmed audiences in The Karate Kid. The sparkle was tempered, the smile still luminous, carried an undertone of lived experience. She began to seek different roles, darker, messier, more human. Gone were the cheerleaders and perfect girlfriends. In their place came survivors, fighters, women with broken pieces and quiet rage, characters that allowed her to exercise, little by little, the pain she carried. It wasn't a calculated rebrand. It was survival through storytelling. In Leaving Las Vegas, 1995, Shue portrayed Sarah, a sex worker entangled in a doomed romance with a suicidal alcoholic. The film was raw, unflinching, and brutally honest. Her performance was nothing short of revelatory. The Academy took notice. So did critics. So did an entire generation who had grown up with her and now saw her not as a pretty face, but a vessel for pain, strength, and silent complexity. She wasn't just acting, one critic wrote. She was bleeding beautifully. But with recognition came risk. Leaving Las Vegas was a peak, but also a turning point. Offers that followed were varied, but many came with strings. Hollywood, as always, sought to box her in. The tragic muse, the emotionally damaged lover, the high-browed darling with a past. She refused to be caged. Rather than chase awards, she chose meaning. Elisabeth stepped back from the red carpets and leaned into parts that spoke to her. Smaller films, character roles, television projects where depth trumped glamour. She also took on motherhood. In 1997, she married filmmaker Davis Guggenheim and soon began raising a family. For a while, domestic life became her center. She traded scripts for school runs, dialogue for dinner tables. It wasn't retirement. It was redefinition. The industry predictably called it a fade-out. But those close to her knew better. She wasn't fading. She was choosing, with intention, with grace, with defiance. And when she returned again, it was on her own terms. In the 2000s and 2010s, Elisabeth reemerged not as a starlet, but as a woman in full control of her image. She took roles in Hollow Man, House at the End of the Street, CSI Crime Scene Investigation, and more recently, The Boys, where she played Madeline Stillwell, a powerful corporate figure with a chilling calm. Gone was the girl next door. In her place stood a woman unafraid to wield authority, to blur morality, to be complicated. It was the reinvention no one had seen coming, but one that felt utterly right. She had weathered more than Hollywood breakups and bad scripts. She had survived real loss, and through that loss, she had learned how to reclaim her own narrative, quietly, precisely, and without apology. For Elisabeth Shue, the industry never defined her. She shaped herself in the spaces between roles, in the pauses between scenes, in the silences she chose to keep. She was no longer sculpted by directors or studios. She was sculpting herself. And in doing so, she became something rarer than famous. She became authentic. The stage was set. The cameras rolled. The lights hit just right. In 1995, Elisabeth Shue walked into the Academy Awards as a nominee for Best Actress, a recognition she had never chased but had undeniably earned. Leaving Las Vegas was the kind of film that left audiences wrecked and silent, and Shue's performance as Sarah wasn't just praised, it was haunting. She held pain in her eyes like an old friend. Her voice, trembling yet strong, delivered truths that no costume or lighting could enhance. She wasn't performing, she was surviving. It was, by all accounts, her defining moment. The critics agreed. So did her peers. She had ascended, not just from teen stardom to adulthood, but into that elusive realm of serious actress, a space where women are finally allowed complexity, but only for a short time. Because in Hollywood, there's always a catch. Success for women comes with an expiration date after the Oscars. Shue didn't become the face of every auteur's next film. She didn't land the prestige projects the industry reserved for its darlings. In fact, the roles began to slow. The scripts became thinner. The praise dimmed. She had poured her soul into leaving Las Vegas, and in return, Hollywood gave her a pat on the back and turned to someone younger, and so began the cruel paradox. At her peak, she was more respected than ever, but also more invisible. Elisabeth wasn't scandalous. She wasn't tabloid bait. She didn't chase attention. She wasn't complicated in the way that sells magazine covers. She was mature, elegant, and unmarketable in a world obsessed with reinvention via controversy. And yet, she continued, quietly, steadily. She took on Hollow Man 2000, opposite Kevin Bacon, a science fiction thriller that put her back into blockbuster territory. But even then, the film didn't celebrate her. It dressed her in lab coats and distress. It used her presence, not her depth. She tried television, navigating supporting arcs and recurring roles. But the momentum she once carried, the next Meryl Streep whispers from a few years prior, were now barely echoes. Outside the industry, things were changing too. Motherhood brought joy, but also a kind of quiet eclipse. Hollywood doesn't forgive women for stepping away, not even for their children. For male actors, fatherhood is a badge of honor. For women, it's seen as distraction, a liability. By the mid-2000s, Elisabeth Shue had become a name that triggered nostalgia. Interviewers asked her more about the Karate Kid than about her recent projects. She smiled through it, gracious as always, but inside, a reality loomed. She had reached a summit, and then the mountain moved. Still, she never resented the silence, because Elisabeth knew that the roles Hollywood denied her never truly reflected what she had to give. She had already proven her capacity for greatness and didn't need a gold statue or a franchise to validate it. The price of her peak wasn't failure, it was clarity. She understood that the world wanted her to stay in one shape, forever youthful, forever accessible. But she had grown. She had changed. And the roles didn't follow her into that evolution. So she began to choose differently, not by headline, not by paycheck, but by purpose. When she took on the chilling role of Madeline Stillwell in The Boys, 2019, audiences saw a new Elisabeth. Cold, calculated, corporate. The performance was a revelation, not because it was flashy, but because it was earned. This was not the Elisabeth Shue of the 80s. This was a woman who had lived, lost, loved, and returned with steel in her spine. And suddenly, the world remembered. The same eyes that had once lit up prom scenes now delivered boardroom menace. The same mouth that had kissed boyish co-stars now issued threats with unsettling calm. It wasn't a comeback. It was a reclamation. And in doing so, Elisabeth Shue didn't just remind Hollywood who she was. She reminded them that depth doesn't age, truth doesn't fade, talent doesn't expire. Elisabeth Shue never vanished. She didn't flame out in scandal. She didn't spiral into bitterness. She didn't cry out for attention when the industry turned its head. Instead, she remained present, resilient, quietly profound. In a world that demands reinvention through spectacle, she chose authenticity. In an industry obsessed with youth, she aged with grace and agency, and through it all, through loss, through fame, through the silence between roles, She never stopped being real. Her legacy is not etched in tabloid headlines or viral moments. It lives in the women who watched her and believed they, too, could lead without loudness. It lives in the performances where pain wasn't performed but understood. It lives in every frame where her eyes said more than dialogue ever could. And maybe most of all, her legacy lives in the absence of ego, in the space where stardom meets humility, where grief becomes art, where strength whispers instead of shouts. She didn't need to burn bright to be unforgettable. She became something rarer than famous. She became true.